Welcome everybody to installment 3 of our 4-part series on philosophy and climate change. Very pleased tonight we have Roman Frigg from, you know there was another town called London? Yeah, so he's from the London School of Economics in the other London. And he's going to talk about climate change and intergenerational justice. Before Roman starts, I just want to mention another event you might be interested in tomorrow night, 7 to 9, at Western University in Spencer Engineering, room 1200. We've got a panel on climate policy featuring Gary Brown, who is a local community activist known to many of you. Heather Douglas, a philosopher from University of Waterloo, Rastislav Dimitrov, political science, who has dealt with political scientist at Western, who has dealt with issues of international climate treaties, and Jeffrey Simpson, well known to you as a columnist for the Boston Globe. So please join us for that, Spencer Engineering, Western, 7 o'clock tomorrow night. And now, Roman Frigg.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. So the program for tonight is really, as the title said, to say something about intergenerational justice, and to do this with a special focus on the discount rate. And this is not because I like the discount rate in particular, but this is because this is how the debate is typically phrased. When you read newspaper articles, and of course professional journal publications, a lot of the issues are framed in terms of what's the right value for the discount rate. So what I'm going to do today is explain what that strange thing is. So what do we mean by discount rate? Tell you how this relates to issues of climate change, and I'm going over a couple of problems and controversies. So here's the plan. I have a few preliminaries about climate change. You will forgive me, I'm brief here because that's not the actual topic for tonight. Introduce the basic question, and then have a part 1 on discounting, and what binds the sections in part 1 together is that in part 1 I take the discounting framework as a given. So the question I want to discuss here is that supposing we're willing to buy into that framework, what does the framework say, and what conclusions can we draw? And in part 2, which is the shorter part, I want to raise a few questions about the framework itself and ask, is this really the right way to discuss the whole issue? All right, so with talks about climate change, it's probably good to start by stating the obvious, or at least to most people the obvious, namely that climate change is real. The global mean temperature is rising, the ice is melting, sea levels are rising, and glaciers are melting. And also, at least a good part of it is due to human action. We burn fossil fuels, cement, we burn coal for electricity. And this is meant to indicate that all the basic processes are very well understood. I mean, so we understand the physics behind it. Now you want proof. Well, here is proof for you. So, well, that's of course a bit flippant. But rather than giving you a lengthy argument, let me just make a sociological point. I think the science has been hammered home once again just by the most recent IPCC report. And there is a growing consensus that this is just a reality. And just to give you a little proof for the claim that there is a sort of a consensus, here is a quote from someone who's not exactly representing an environmental charity. So here's I'm a chairman of Exxon, who says, well, so, as you know, it's a basic fact of physics that CO2 traps heat, and too much CO2 will mean that it will get too hot, and we will face enormous risks as a result of this, not only to our way of life, but also to the world economy. It will be devastating, the seas will rise, the coastlines will be unstable for generations, the price of food will go crazy. This is what we face, and we all know it. So that's the chairman of an oil company. So, well, what exactly, or slightly more precisely, here is what we could face. By 2100, a rise in global average temperature of about 4 centigrades compared to pre-industrial level, a rise in sea levels of about 60 centimeters or more, and if you're really unlucky and all the ice melts away, it could be up to 6 meters. And the acidity of the sea will go up due to absorption of CO2. Now, I should say there is, of course, some uncertainty about what this means at the local scale. I mean, global mean temperature going up is one thing. Things changing here in London is another thing. So there are subtle questions here, but with these facts in mind, it's sort of plausible to assume that coastal regions will be affected. I mean, if sea levels rise by ½ a meter, a number of football stadiums in Florida will be underwater. Some of the agricultural zones will shift. Probably the frequency of severe weather events could increase, and as a result, a social structure will be disturbed, and that could lead to all kinds of difficulties. So much for what roughly the scenario of climate change would be. Now, the basic questions that you face in the policy arena is, what do you do about it? And there's two things you can do. You can adapt, which is basically to take measures to protect ourselves against the effects of climate change, for instance, by building flood walls, if you're in a coastal region, or you can mitigate, and mitigation means that you try to prevent as much climate change as you can, most notably by lowering CO2 emissions so that heating is reduced, for instance, by using fossil fuels or other eco-friendly technologies. And sort of the basic questions in the policy arena is, well, do you mitigate or do you adapt? So on the one hand, it would be best for present societies to mitigate as little as possible. We just keep using cheap energy because that helps the economy and it supports our way of life. However, on the other hand, it would be better for future generations if we mitigate it now to reduce our emissions quickly so that they won't have to deal with severe effects of climate change later. Now, which of the two should we choose? That's the fundamental question. So here's a little caveat. I'm presenting this as a dichotomy to get the argument going. In reality, we have to do a little bit of both options. So you have to mitigate a bit, you have to adapt a bit. I mean, in fact, we are already committed to some climate change, so you have to adapt to some extent. The question is really how much mitigation and how much adaptation do you need? However, that doesn't really play much of a role for the argument. So I discuss it as an either or, and then a blending between the two is relatively straightforward. Okay, so that's our question for tonight. Now, part one is I want to begin by introducing the concept of discounting. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is because much of the climate debate in the policy arena is framed in terms of discounting. And as I already mentioned also at the beginning, part one takes the framework as given. So the question I discuss in part one is that if we buy into the framework, then what? Good. What's the discount rate? Now, discounting, generally speaking, is a method to compare the value of present goods and of future goods. And there are basically two positions in the debate, where the current generation should make significant sacrifices for the sake of future generations, and the other is, Well, you should not make any such sacrifices, and the motivations behind these two lie typically in different choices of the discount rate. So what is this thing? So let's have a little poll here. So assume I make you an offer and say, well, I'm going to give you $100, and you can choose. You can either have it now, or you can have it a year from now. So who would go for now? Who would have it a year from now? A few. So if I offer you 100 now or 500 in a year's time, who would have 100 now? 500 in a year's time? Good. So trickier, so closer to reality as well. So obviously talking about climate change, you want to buy a solar-powered car, and you have a choice to pay 10,000 now or 11,000 in 5 years. Which one would you choose? Less clear. Good. Now so these are the questions that motivate the introduction of the discount rate. So the observation that we have just made in our little poll is that the value of money changes over time. So most of you rather have $100 now than $100 in a year's time. So $100 now are somehow worth more than $100 in a year's time. For $500, it may be a different story. And you can measure how much value you lose over time with the discount rate, which basically says how many % of the value gets lost during a year. And then you can just do basic arithmetic. This is not more complicated than calculating the rate that you pay for your mortgage. So here's your little formula. So P is the present value, that's your $100, say. F is the future value, and you can calculate the present value as a function of the future value, or you can of course flip them over by simply dividing them by 1 plus R, and that's a discount rate measured in %, divided by 100, and then you take this to the power of n, where n is just a number of years. If this is for 1 year, n is simply 1. So you can take your pocket calculator and type that in. That's exactly what I've done for the examples. So let's assume we have a discount rate of 5%. So we're losing 5% of value over a year. Now, $100 now, in a year's time, is worth approximately $95. And that's why most of you prefer to have the $100 now. Now, you can have $100 now or 500 in a year's time. Now, the current value of $500 is approximately 476, so you should wait for a year. And with the solar car, if you do the same thing, is the current value of 11,000 is approximately 8,620, as your pocket calculator tells you. So you definitely should pay this amount in 5 years. So you wait. These are the simple calculations you make. So, summary, what have we done so far? We established that money in the future is worth less than money now. The process of calculating the present value of a future expense is called discounting. As a general rule, the larger your discount rate, the less the future expense is worth in the present. That's basically what you have to take away from this first section. Now, why do we discount? What are the reasons behind discounting? And one reason is what one calls pure discounting. And here you find one factor that's very human. We are simply not patient enough to wait. So you just don't want to wait. You want it now rather than in a year's time. So that's what philosophers called weakness of the will. So better now than later. But maybe a bit more serious, there's also risks. I mean, you may get run over by a bus when you walk out of the library, and you will never benefit from the $100 I promise you in a year's time if you wait. So you may want to minimize risk by having your money as soon as you can. So these reasons sort of fall under pure discounting. But when you talk to economists, they also have further reasons. So there is what they call gross discounting. And the premise of this argument, and we will come back to this argument, so I'm just giving you the argument now. I'm not saying this is the ultimate truth of the matter. So the premise is that economic growth will continue and people in the future will be richer than people now. And then a piece of economic wisdom kicks in, namely diminishing marginal benefits. Now that's a grand word, but it's very intuitive. And you can think of wine, for instance. If you like drinking wine, if you have no wine and someone offers you a bottle of wine, that's a huge increase in your utility because you compare no wine with one bottle of wine. Now, if you have one bottle of wine and you get another bottle of wine, that may still be an increase because you like to drink 2 bottles rather than 1. Now you continue that. Say you have 10,000 bottles of wine and someone wants to give you another bottle. You say, well, that's very nice, but it's really not of much use because there's only so much wine you can drink. The argument is the same here. So if you give more wealth to people who are already wealthy, this is actually not very useful to them. So, and if you now also believe that future generations will be wealthier than us, then more wealth to them will be less useful than to us. So therefore you should discount. That's one of the arguments. Now, why is the premise true? Why are future generations wealthier than us? Well, the idea here is that basically technology is fertile. Current commodity can always be turned into more future commodities. And the simple example that's often given, if you have a little forest and you're into timber production, you can cut all your trees now, sell the wood and cash in, or you can have the trees grow for another year and you have more wood next year. So basically the idea is that you can always save some goods to produce more future benefits, and that's why wealth is accumulating towards the future. Now we'll see later whether that's entirely right or not. Good, let's come back to our initial question. So what does all that have to do with climate change? So why do we have to learn about discounting climate? What we're really interested in is climate change. Now recall, the main question is, do we mitigate now or do we adapt in the future? Now you see where this is going. This question involves a comparison between current and future values. And that's where the discount rate kicks in. So for instance, compare the following 2 policies. So you can spend 100 billion now to reduce carbon emissions, for instance, by investing into biofuels. Or you can spend 1 trillion 100 years from now in dealing with the impacts of climate change, for instance, by building flood walls. So this is a very clear policy decision you can make. Now, which one do you choose? Now, the answer in the given framework is you simply calculate the current value of 1 trillion and compare it to 100 billions, and you do whatever is cheaper. Now, you take a discount rate of 3%, then the present value of 1 trillion is 52 billion. So to invest 1 trillion for adaptation in 100 years seems to be the better option. It's simply cheaper. If, however, your discount rate is only 2%, the present value of 1 trillion is 138 billion. So to invest 100 billion now into mitigation is actually the cheaper option. So what you see in this very simple example is that your conclusion very sensitively depends on the choice of the discount rate. So choosing 3% versus 2% flips the conclusion you reach completely. So in one choice, you mitigate, and the other you adapt. Yeah?
In that third line from the bottom, it says invest 1 trillion for adaptation in 100 years. Don't you mean invest 52 billion for adaptation in 100 years? 52 billion now would return 100 trillion in 100 years.
Yes, but the question is, so your choice is between this. You can either spend 100 billion now, and that's simply what your policy costs, or you can spend 1 trillion in 100 years. And you ask which one is cheaper. And then you figure out, well, actually, doing this in 100 years is cheaper than doing this now. Is that clear now? Yeah. Okay, good. So, and there's a further important aspect here, and that comes back to the title of the lecture. If you consider large n, and you recall n is the number of years, then we're actually not talking about ourselves. We're talking about future generations. And when we talk about 100 years from now, it's very likely that we all won't be around anymore. So we're talking about our children and our grandchildren. So really what we're talking about is we express a preference for us to consume over the preference of future generation to be able to consume if we choose a certain value of the discount rate. So in that sort of dry calculation, you find actually hidden a question of intergenerational justice. So what value for the interest rate you choose is also a reflection on what value you give to future generations. I come back to this point. I just want to highlight this now. Now the controversy is sort of carried out by many people, but there are two protagonists. One is my LSE colleague Nick Stern. In the famous Stern review, said that we should have a relatively low value of the interest rate, and he gives 1.4%. And he argues that the pure time discounting, you remember we have seen this before, this is basically you being impatient, should be almost zero on moral grounds. And then you get an effective discounting rate of about 1.4%. Now this is vigorously denied by William Nordhaus of Yale, who says that the review's conclusion about the need for extreme and immediate action will not survive the substitution of discounting assumptions that are consistent with today's marketplace. So Nordhaus says, no, look, Stern's discount rate is far too low. We need a higher discount rate, and his figure is about 5.5%. And his reason is that this is the discount rate you find in financial markets. So we have reached an impasse. One says 1.4%, the other says 5.5%. And as we have seen before, your policy decisions really depend on these values. So, it's really not just an academic dispute here. Whether you mitigate now or you adapt later depends on these values. So what are the arguments for market discount rates? For what I can see, there are basically two arguments here. One is on the people's choice argument, which, in a nutshell, is that market prices reveal people's real choices and preferences, and these preferences should be respected. And the future wealth argument, which we have already seen in some form, namely future generations are richer and therefore are in a better position to pay for adaptation than we are to pay for mitigation. So what I'm going to do now is look a bit more carefully at these arguments. So do they really hold water? So let's start with people's choice. So the argument here is, as I have just mentioned, that interest rates represent true preferences. You have a free market, the market plays out. If people are willing to borrow and lend money at 5%, then that is the relative value that people put on future commodities. And then our governments should respect people's choice, and therefore should use market discount rates in making decisions about the future. And more specifically for this reason, of course, market discount rate should be used to set climate policies. That's the argument. Now, how good an argument is this? So the crux here is in the question of which people's choices is represented in a market discount rate. So I'm bracketing fundamental worries about markets. The worry is still that a market, even if it's a perfect market, can only reflect the preferences of those people who actually participate in the market. However, people who live in 100 years, they're not participating in the market. So the preferences of future people simply are not taken into account in current money markets. I mean, simply because these people are not participating there. So now, oh, sorry, I already said that. So people who are not represented can't have their preferences reflected. Now let's make a thought experiment. Let's set up what is called the future trust. The future trust just represents the interest of future people, just like trusts can represent all kinds of interests. And the future trust comes to the market and basically starts buying all kind of commodities that relate to the future. So the trust would invest in goods 100 years from now. So what would be the effect of this? Now the trust comes in, starts buying future goods, and then simply the law of supply and demand kicks in. That's the market mechanism. And the value of the future goods will go up because there is a demand for it. And the result would be that the discount rate would go down because future goods are worth more. So the conclusion is that if you represent the preferences of future people in the market, you would actually get a different discount rate in the market, and the discount rate would actually go down. So for this reason, just using current discount rates doesn't seem to be a very good idea. Good. That I've told you already. So, future wealth. How good is that argument? As we have seen already, there is sort of a view around that wealth keeps accumulating, and it's sort of a given that future generations will be better off than present generations. And since future generations are better off, their marginal utility for more wealth is smaller, hence you should discount. Now, there are also questions about this here. In fact, climate change could reverse this trend. We can't just take it as a given that wealth will simply be accumulating forever. I mean, if things go really bad, then it could happen that huge agricultural regions suddenly don't yield anymore in the same way they yield now. Food production becomes more expensive, water becomes more expensive, whatnot. So it could be that if environmental problems become serious enough, wealth would actually decrease rather than increase, and then we would suddenly have a negative discount rate, which is surely not what the argument would have. Second, the argument disregards concerns about justice. So what lies behind this argument is the view that those who are better off should pick up the tab. And that's not really the case. So just imagine what your neighbor would say if you knock at her door and say, listen, you're much wealthier than I am, so I might have a problem, and you take care of it. She will probably say no. So there is an issue of justice here, so that those who are better off are not necessarily responsible for sorting out the the problem. So and the same applies to future generations. So if that future generations are better off does not ipso facto imply that they have to solve the problems that we have created. And there is sort of a little sidekick here as well. So if you're willing to discount utility of those who have more, then you have to realize that this argument is actually not inherently temporal, whether these rich people are future rich people or current rich people plays no role in the argument. So if you think that this is a good argument, you also have to reach the conclusion that since further wealth is not that useful to people who are already wealthy than it is for people who are not so wealthy, you would then have to argue for strong redistribution of wealth, which is obviously something that people who typically argue for this position don't like. So it's really a bit of a catch-22. So either you have to deny that market interest rates are the right ones, or you have to argue for social justice, and neither of which is a desirable conclusion.
Those 10,000 bottles of wine
yeah.
are still accepting more wine.
They are accepting, but if you take the argument seriously, and if you take marginal utility seriously, so if you take the economic theory behind this seriously, their utility is much smaller than the utility that someone would have who has only one bottle of wine. And if you think then a perfect system is one where utility is maximized, you would reach the conclusion that you have to redistribute your bottles of wine. And this is the same argument as the argument that future generations, because they're wealthier, have to deal with the problems that we created. It's the same ethical argument. So if you think that dumping the problems on future generations is right, you also have to think that redistributing wealth now should be right. And typically, people who want to accept one conclusion don't want to accept the other conclusion. So there is a little inconsistency in their position to sort out. But that's a side remark for the fun of it. So nothing in the main argument depends on this. Is my technology letting me down? No, here we go. So the conclusion I'm drawing from this is there is no sound argument for taking market and discount rates as the right discount rates for climate policy. In fact, there are good reasons to assume that the correct discount rate in the climate context should be lower than market discount rates, and that, I think, is one up for Stern. A further problem in this debate is that the whole discount rate discussion doesn't take spatial inequality into account, and that's a point that has been made strongly by Dasgupta in Cambridge. He says, look, the approach is completely blind to the spatial distribution of wealth. This is compatible with some nations and some people having an awful lot and others having very little. And if one wanted to be an egalitarian between generations, which is what those with a low interest rate want, one also should be an egalitarian between nations. I mean, why should we treat future people different than people who live at a different place? And, well, unfortunately, we are far away from that. And if we took this seriously, this would have dramatic consequences. So here are a few figures. These are from 2005, but I suppose this gap has widened, if anything. So here is the global per capita emission of CO2 equivalents for different nations. For the United States, you have 5.32 metric tons. I suppose Canada is close second here. The United Kingdom has 2.47, China 1.16. Then you go to India, 0.35, and Bangladesh has 0.08. So you see the huge disparity in consumption of fossil fuels. Now assume we want to achieve two goals. So if we want to reduce the total emissions by 20% and redistribute all the rest fairly, this implies that the following reductions would have to be made. So the United States would have to cut reductions by more than 80%, the UK by more than 60%, China by 14%, and in India and Bangladesh, you could start thinking big. They could increase by 285% in India and in Bangladesh by 1,250%. You just see what these numbers give. So there's a serious problem here. I don't have a solution for this. I just want to leave that video so you can think about it. What I want to do now is come back to my conditional if discounting then. So I've done the then part. I've given you a few considerations to think about. Now I want to talk about the if part and worry a bit about whether that's the right framework to think about everything we're dealing with here. And the obvious question is, really, can everything be discounted? So I have two beautiful Canadian landscapes. So is that really the same sort of thing like bottles of wine or cars that we can put sort of future values on, and you can trade and you can run all your financial calculations? And there is a real worry about this. So while the method of discounting has plausibility for market commodities, it doesn't seem to be very plausible for non-marketable goods. So some goods just seem to have a value that is simply not commensurate with market goods. And one example is the one I just had up here, which is nature. I mean, and what's the price of a nice lake? What's the price of a forest? You can try to auction it off, but that probably tells you how much a wealthy person is willing to pay for it. Whether that gives you the actual value of it is a completely different question. And I have doubts that there is a serious answer to that. So again, that's something for you to think about. I'm not trying to sell you a particular solution here, but I want to draw your attention to this. Just for the sake of argument, let's assume we can put a value on it. Somehow we figure out how many millions a nice forest is worth. The next question is then, should that value be discounted? And again, the answer here seems to be no. I mean, a stretch of a beautiful countryside is a commodity whose value simply should not be discounted. It should have a discount rate of 0. Now, why is that? Now, we have seen at the beginning that we are given two reasons for discounting. One is pure discounting. So you're impatient and you're worried about risk so that you can't benefit from future commodities because something may happen in the meantime. Or the other is gross discounting because the value of something keeps growing. Now, neither of these reasons seem to apply to nature. There's no reason to be impatient. You have it now. So all your lakes and mountains are there for you. So there's nothing to wait for. It's not like you have to wait for $100 that they'll give you in a year's time. So nature is there for you now. So pure time discounting is not an argument here. Neither is gross discounting. So nature per se is not fertile in the sense that some other goods are fertile we have seen before. So you can't turn nature into a greater amount of nature by waiting in the same way that you can turn some goods into more goods, like with your timber example we had before. So to nature as a whole, that sort of argument doesn't seem to apply. there's a deeper reason still why we should not discount nature. So discounting, and here we get into deeply philosophical territory, discounting should apply to commodities, but it should not apply to well-being. So you can't discount well-being. So current well-being is not worth more than future well-being. But nature is an essential part of well-being. So that is a reason, or further reason, why we shouldn't discount nature in the way we discount wine or cars. Okay, so much for discounting nature. Now, just a few reflections to wrap up. I mean, the whole framework in which we have been operating is sort of utilitarian ethics, that you think a good action is one that maximizes utility in a given society. Very roughly, how to articulate that precisely is, of course, a formidable problem, but that's basically the framework in which you operate. However, that's not the only game in town. I mean, utilitarianism is one theory of ethics, but there are others. You can have a Kantian ethics, for instance, which doesn't consider utility at all. Things have value in themselves, and Kantians hold that certain things like your own body parts, for instance, can never be used for any purposes because they have a value that is just not tradable. Or if you go to other cultural spheres, Confucianism will probably have a very different approach to nature. I know almost nothing about this. I just mentioned this again to give you food for thought, something to think about. So what would happen if we leave the utilitarian framework in which we have discussed all that? How would this whole discussion look like? And this is not so much discussed, for what I can see, but I think it would be an interesting question, and if some of you want to delve into ethical theory, maybe that's an interesting question to think about. Okay, some conclusions. When you decide on climate policy, and if you do use the discounting framework, then you should not use market discount rates because they don't reflect the value of all participants, which includes future generation. So, and also there are questions about whether you should discount certain things at all. And if we take these considerations seriously, we reach the conclusion that we should invest into serious mitigation and not leave it to future generation to tidy up what we do. And on that note, I say thank you very much.
We have time for questions. Yes, sir.
Back again.
Welcome.
My first question is, before I make a comment, is what department are you from? And you're from Western, are you?
No, I'm from the London School of Economics in the other London.
Oh, I see. You're not a scientist. You're not from any physics.
No,
biology.
My paycheck comes from a philosophy department.
Yes.
I
now-
might have a degree in physics if that makes you more
sorry,
comfortable.
If you have a question, probably relevant to the topic.
Okay, to the topic. As somebody from the science department, I find it sort of frightening in a way that you have built this massive building on top of what somebody from you quoted up there a thing about somebody from Exxon or something, some executive or within the...
Yeah, it's the CEO of Exxon.
Yeah, well, that's sort of funny in a way, isn't it? I mean, if you built it on a whole bunch of really big-time people in climatology, paleoclimatology, then I'd be impressed. But that doesn't appear to be the truth. And you mentioned tons of this and tons of that of CO2, but you don't say what is our percent that we give to CO2 in the world, and what do plants give? We give almost nothing. You know, this is, and the fact you assume by consensus that we in the science department agree with you, and we certainly don't.
Well, I would refer you to the recent IPCC report, which
Yes, IPCC. You know, in the Senate report to the U.S. Senate, when the U.S. Senate under the Democrats decided not to go ahead with the carbon tax, 700 scientists said no to it. 53, all from the International Panel for Climate Change. It shows you that maybe they're under the thumb, the financial thumb of the Democratic Party.
I doubt that, but...
Well, just a fact. Check it out. Google it.
Anyone have a comment relevant to that?
Yeah, I suppose I have a question about this one, right? So thank you. I guess I'd like to hear your talk about, I'm sure Derek Park is familiar with
Yes.
this objection that if you use any discount rate, you just have to push the time long enough, and then it'll just be, we'll be talking about massive catastrophe in the future. So I just crunched the numbers really quick, and if we made the decision, so we adopt a conservative 2% discount rate, and then say we have a choice between 100 people that die for climate-related reasons now. With 2% discount rate, it takes 125 years before we're talking about 8 billion people as the equivalent. It only takes 125 years. It's just the magic of compound interest. So I'd like to hear your sort of comments about that, because it seems like once we do that and start talking far enough in the future and think about catastrophic numbers, that discount rates somehow seem irrelevant if we're talking about existential crises for such large numbers of people.
Why are they becoming irrelevant? It just shows maybe that you should be more careful about the numbers you use. Maybe the discount rate is even lower than 2%, could be. Or then it shows that if you have 200 dying now, that's even too much. So I don't think this makes it irrelevant. It just shows you that bad things happen, right?
Right. I suppose it's irrelevant is the wrong word to use. It really grinds against our intuitions if we're somehow even entertaining the thought of weighing 100 people now against 8 billion people in 125 years. It just seems like something that, well, seems like a calculation we shouldn't be making, I guess.
So what conclusion would you draw from this? That the whole discounting framework is a bad framework to discuss these problems in? Is that the conclusion you would want to take from this, or?
No, because I was an economics.
This is an honest question. This is not a rhetoric question.
No, I still want to hold on to a discount rate, but I have very ill-informed opinions about it. And when I think about it ethically on one hand versus in terms of actually trying to do some sort of economic calculation, the spheres don't mix very well. It's like we were talking about certain things that don't enter very well to market calculus.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that once you're talking about people's lives, it just doesn't seem like.
Yeah, I guess this is the conclusion I would take away from this, to say, look, maybe these things are like the forests and on the lakes, that you simply can't squeeze into that framework, and a different ethical theory may be more appropriate to this sort of thing. So I think I would accept that. I just try to explain what there is. So in the sense, just I'm giving you tools for thought, that when you see the discount rate, that you know what the thing is all about. I'm not actually subscribing to this necessarily myself. So if you want to take away the conclusion from this, that most things that really matter don't fit into that framework, I think I could live with that conclusion myself very well. So,
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the question of economics, growth and jobs and so on arose several years ago in London concerning the southeast quadrant of the city. And it happened that Walmart wanted to build a fourth store here, and several big box stores taking up a huge amount of space. This is actually what they had drafted initially, just to give you an idea. And it seemed no one could stop them because they were going to bring lots of prosperity to London at large and certainly the local community in terms of jobs, right? But these would be minimum wage jobs, but yeah, jobs. And basically this entire area would be covered with asphalt, right? And then the big box stores tented on top. Typical mall area. The only flaw was, is that this is immediately adjacent to an ESA, a environmentally significant area as designated by the province. And so when I found out that nobody could seem to stop them, and they of course were very determined in developing this spot, I went and researched how they were able to get into wherever they wanted to go around the world. Like, for instance, they actually built a place right next to a amber tiger reserve in India or Pakistan. How were they able to do that when nobody wanted it there? You know, and it would impact negatively the reserve. And here it would very negatively impact the property adjacent. Well, so I realized I would have to come up with something, and so I did, and this is what the result was. And it stopped them. It stopped them. I'm one of very few people who, with the help of others, because we poured over their plans, were able to actually stop them in their tracks. I guess, I don't know if Guelph succeeded. I couldn't even go there, but I just know that people from Guelph came and asked me, how were you able to stop them? Because, you know, and these other areas in Ontario, we can't seem to stop them because they always come up with an alternative, you know, it would supposedly not harm whatever.
Yeah,
You should travel to regions where they deforestate heavily. So.
Yeah, that's a good example of people putting, nature over economic growth, and it works. It's one of the success stories. Meadowlily Woods is still Walmart free. It's looking beautiful this time of year.
Yes, and I mean, they continue to come back, revisit it in the form of threatening to sue the city. Now, I think they've stopped. I'm not absolutely positive. But it's my understanding that actually they took over the old Roma store, which was right across the street on the south side of Commissioner's Road. But to stop them required a great deal of work on my behalf and several other people, because we had to pour over their studies. And one of them that I was able to read very easily, of course, was the highly technical couple of studies on the environmental impact. And I went nose to nose with them, actually, head to head with them with the presentation. So I put forth a 26-point page PowerPoint presentation, and this was the concluding image.
Yeah.
This is just a perspective of one little area of it, right?
Yeah, that's worth mentioning. You know, citizens groups, can go up against big corporations in win fights like that. So.
And this would have geothermal heating and cooling and so on. So.
Yeah, no, so Nordhaus is a smart guy, and your arguments are interesting. Which one does he have the most interesting reply to, or which one does he have the most difficulty with, or do you have an idea of how he views these kinds of responses?
Well, look, I didn't follow up what he himself says, but in this camp, there are various arguments from theory of democracy to be made here. Some people respond, Margalit, for instance, responds to saying, look, if you look at what governments should do, they are responsible to take care of the interest of the current electorate, not of the future electorate. All these thought experiments, they are just no good. So you have people now, you take the current people's preferences And that's really what matters. So that's what you should take care of. So a government should take care of future generations if current people have a preference to take care of future generations. But you can't put future generations into this mix by thought experiments, future trusts and things like that. So that's just fiction. That's not what happens in a real market situation. So your government should take care of what current people want. And if current people don't care about the future, then so will be it. And then you're back to the view that current markets actually do reflect people's choices, those people who are really in the market now, and that's what matters. So governments don't have an obligation towards future generations. They have an obligation towards the current electorate, and that's it. So that's one way to respond to this. And then obviously you can start quarreling about whether that's right or not. So.
Well, it's not difficult to stuff misinformation down people's throats, and Walmart has it down for science, correct? Mm-hmm. And so does the federal government.
Yeah.
And I think the IPCC does as well.
Yeah. I'd like to ask what I hope is a simple question, but you know, when you use the discount, you showed us the formula, and so on and so forth. I teach math to students who are taking a unit on a financial topic. And my background's not in that area. And when I look at the textbook and there's a section about interest and a section on discount, the question I always ask is, why are they two separate sections? Aren't they the same thing? And why don't we just talk about interest instead of discount all the time? What's the advantage of having a separate topic called discount when the topic of interest covers everything?
So you think the interest rate is effectively the same thing as the discount rate? I mean, look, from a mathematical point of view, they are the same thing. I mean, if you prefer to talk about your rate of interest rather than of discount, then I don't think that's a problem. However, typically this is much narrower because when you talk about interest, you're squarely in the domain of finance. You pay interest on your mortgage. You're not paying interest on your wine, or you're not paying interest on other goods. And the idea is that discounting is a much more general concept, and the rate of discount is set by considerations that go beyond setting an interest rate in a financial context. I mean, what I pay for my mortgage is basically determined by what the central bank in the country in which I live think is a reasonable rate, and larger consideration of value for the future and so on don't really factor into what I pay for my mortgage. And the idea is that discounting would be a much broader concept, but you're entirely right that from a mathematical point of view, it functions in the same way.
May I follow up? Yeah. When we see the discount rate used in a more or less financial context, it's always something like bonds or something like that. Are you saying then that those areas of the financial world that use discount rather than calculating it as interest are in some way more broadly based on some other sense of values other than just a monetary calculation?
Look, I'm no expert on the bond markets. I'm out of my depth here, so I don't know how exactly they set prices for bonds, but probably they depending on what goes into that bond. I mean, a bond is a very broad concept. You can have very different types of bonds. I can well imagine that setting a discount rate for a bond would have different considerations than setting the interest rates for a mortgage. And I think that would be the reasoning, but I think someone trading in bonds would be better qualified to answer that question. But I would speculate that this is the answer one should give to this.
Thank you.
Or maybe someone here an expert on this? Maybe.
I'm not an expert, but I just
Yeah.
want to add a footnote to that. Following up on what the gentleman guy said, maybe, and I think this is in line with your conclusion, maybe it actually is a mistake to use discounting when you're dealing with non-financial things.
Mhm.
But when you ask the question, would you rather have $100 now or $100 a year from now? Well, give me if I want $100 a year from now, you can give it to me now and put it in the bank and have $100 plus interest a year from now, right? So in pure financial terms, $100 from now is worth $100 plus interest a year from now. All we care about a year from
I
now.
have to admit, that's where I was thinking about
Right, yeah.
that, because my
Yeah,
students
but-
are not going to be financial experts.
Right,
They ask me that question.
and accountants, when they're valuing the present value of future income, they use a discount rate which is based on whatever a safe investment is. Right. And maybe it's just a mistake to use it in a broader context. I mean, it makes perfectly good sense if you want something you put in the bank and earn interest on. Obviously,
But
yeah, but things like human lives or.
look, I mean, just to follow up on this, I think your example shows nicely how the more works. I mean, you can put it in a bank and cash in interest, but then the further question is, what is the buying power of that money a year from now? If you get 5% interest and you're up again 15% inflation, then it's something else.
We're assuming the interest rate is greater than the rate of interest.
See, you're making assumptions here.
Well,
So
okay.
and also you have to assume that all the goods you want to buy will still be available in a year's time, and maybe I desire goods that are scarce, and I have no guarantee that the thing I want to buy a year from now is actually still available a year from now, etc., etc., etc. I think this is where the extra comes in that's not reflected in a purely financial interest rate.
Yeah, I just want to jump off what you were just saying there, is that there's some information that can go into a discount rate that doesn't go into interest. So if we're just talking about interest, yeah, we can put it in the bank, we have compound interest, sure, we can discount interest, whatever. But some things, like you're saying, you can have either time preference or maybe there's some sort of certainty you get from having a good now that, we could talk about bananas and say, I could prefer 10 bananas now to 150 bananas 2 weeks from now. And that there would be some kind of discounting going on there, but bananas don't have interest. It's not like me having bananas now will mean I'll have more bananas later. So that might just be because I'm impatient, which is the information going into it, or maybe it's reducing risk. But I think that's the intuition that people using the social discount rate are trying to get at, is that discounting makes sense in some situations that interest doesn't go well. And maybe we still want to object to the idea that we can discount lives.
Well, deterioration of the adjacent forest, in this particular case that I was speaking of, by Walmart, would happen almost immediately as soon as the entire area was built, because the noise attenuation would be such, the negative impacts from noise alone and pollution too from all the cars and so on, would be such that the border species, such as the scarlet tanager, for instance, would stay away from the edge area, no longer consume or forage from there, and so those trees die. And so the forest dies from the outside edge inward. And there goes our oxygen supply, right? So do we want to be hooked up to machines or have oxygen generators in our homes, each and every one of us, and have to pay for that, or
Got a few people in
and
the
of course,
question
we
queue.
can't walk through the forest anymore because it's.
We've got a few people in the question queue. Sorry, I think you were next.
When thinking about the difference between discount and interest, it occurred to me that interest is more an extrapolation into the future, whereas discounting seems to me, if I'm understanding it correctly, taking something from the imagined future and moving backwards to current value. Is that a fair assumption on my part?
Pragmatically, that's right. That's how the discussion goes, although mathematically that's exactly the same. for instance, when I signed the contract for my mortgage company told me how much I will have paid to them when my mortgage is up in 25 years. It was a shocking revelation. It's more than I'm twice the buying price of the house. So I think pragmatically you're right. In the way we use discounting, it's more to ask, well, how much is something that we have in the future worth now? But you could do exactly the same thing the other way, mathematically speaking.
Did the fact that you're arguing quite lucidly, I might add, in favor of mitigation have anything to do with the use of discount instead of interest?
No,
it's very present.
I just basically took the discounting framework because that's simply what most people in this debate use. But I think if for some reason we agreed that we used discount and interest interchangeably, then you could make the same argument with interest. I don't think the argument depends on that for the reasons you have pointed out, namely the mathematics is exactly the same. So it's the same formula that goes into it. So I don't think anything hangs on that point. So
I'm curious as to
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be there's a number of people who've been waiting to talk. Yes, sir.
One of the issues I see, first of all, I agree with your conclusions, but I get here a different way. One of the questions you have to ask is, what's your base case? And specifically related to this, is nature threatened such that it will threaten humanity? Or do you think that your actions are just going to leave nature unaffected? What I mean is, if you think it's going to leave nature unaffected, I agree that your discount rate, there's no gain in investing in nature, because it's always going to be there. However, if you think that nature's threatened, think of it this way. Every dollar then that you then invest has zero risk. It will always benefit you. So my question is the 5.5%, okay, what's the market? What's the risk aversion profile? Where that number came from? Is it long term? Is it short term? I have all these questions, okay? And it seems like that 5%, what if it was 5.5? It implied serendipity. Let's put it that way. There's no, I didn't hear in the underlying, well, it's short term, or it's long term, or it's such and such risk aversion profile, or it's, there are a million factors that go into that. Okay? It includes the risk of loss. So I find the entire argument of 5.5% to be amazing. that they're even listening to this person who's saying this without justifying where this is coming from and looking at underlying the risk of profile. Okay, my understanding is most human beings below a certain threshold of probability completely discount negative events. Okay, we can't calculate properly in our minds probability to the level that we can or that we need to when you have an extremely low probability event. So we discount it entirely. So he's assuming that this 5.5% is coming from a rational market where they can properly calculate that. Now, we have no idea what, he doesn't say what market it's coming from.
It's coming from financial markets.
Financial markets have their own risk aversion profile, which it doesn't have to apply to all human beings. As you said, as you pointed out, who is benefiting from this? I haven't heard arguments as to why we shouldn't be addressing this 5.5%. It's so bizarre in my mind. I'm sure I'm sure you came up with something.
I think you're preaching to the choir in my case.
It's amazing that they're trying to use this. I mean, if you use 5.5%, sample case, use 5.5%. Okay, let's say a company introduces a pollutant which is going to kill humanity in 500 years. If you use a 5.5% discount rate, we'll value that at 0. It destroys all humanity in 500 years, but because the discount rate is 5.5%, that's okay. Because the future event, the cost of the future event back to present day is zero, almost zero. You know, there's no. I believe in the discount rate, but I also believe it has to be applied appropriately. Yeah. And I think what's happening is people are just using it like the Walmart case, okay, to make arguments that people who haven't studied it and don't understand the markets can't respond to. It's a simple case, and it's being used everywhere, right, in carbon and all the markets. So I really appreciate your analysis because it's something I haven't seen. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I mean, I think I agree with you. I mean, this is taking a bit of theory out of the context in which the theory operates properly. And I guess then we at least have the question, why should we believe that the theory, when taken out of one context, and put into a different context, still works fine? And I think you're making a case that, I mean, this particular case, there are no good arguments, and I think I would agree with that. The hard question you mentioned at the very beginning is nature threatened? And I mean, that's a really hard one, and I mean, we've been all discussing that long. And look, there is some uncertainty there. I mean, we think, we understand global mean values quite well and continental scales and so on. But what does it mean locally? So what does global warming mean for the people in London? Or what does global warming mean for the farmer in Andalusia? There is great uncertainty about this. However, if the climate system changes, it's very unlikely that change will be uniform. It's not the case that your temperature everywhere just is 2 degrees warmer and all the rest stays all the same. I mean, that's not the scenario we're looking at. Something will change, and you can say, well, nature itself doesn't care, or maybe Andalusia becomes a desert and the Russian tundra becomes fertile farming ground, so that may be a zero-sum game. But now factor in a social setup. You can't suddenly put all the Spanish farmer to Russia and tell them to farm there. So if things change, you will be faced with social situations that will be problematic from a political point of view. But there will be a scramble for resources, there will be a scramble for redistribution of resources, etc. And that at the very least will cause problem in the political arena, even if you think that nature on the whole is resilient, which I'm not sure she is, but even if you think that, okay, it's sort of a zero-sum game on the whole, if you factor in that there is a highly sensitive social system put on that, then you reach the conclusion that you're up against high stakes here.
Justin, you want to handle?
Just going off what Wayne said, let's go with the assumption that the discount rate is simply an inappropriate framework for looking at this problem. And you could come to that for moral reasons or some other reasons. What else could you use to inform public policy? Are policy analysts going to pull out the groundwork in metaphysics of morals and go from a Kantian perspective, or what else is there in the current debate?
Well, there are people who argue that nature has a value in itself, and you just can't mess with it, as it were. So that then challenges you to say why you think that is, and going for something like Kantian values is one route you can go. I mean, that's one thing you can do, and that's what some people do. I mean, look, I'm no expert on ethics. I don't know all the positions out there, but that's definitely one position, and that's one I find interesting. I'm not sure I'm buying into it, but that's one thing one can do. And I think it's really sort of a plea for further thoughts, because I think the action is still in the utilitarian framework. I mean, that's where most of the battles are fought. And so if you take your point on board, and I think I sort of sympathize with it as the second part of my talk made clear, this is just an invitation to think harder about what alternative frameworks would be. And one of the questions is, how much ethical theory do you have to import to make your point? And preferably, we would be minimalists here, because if people disagree on science, you can get the idea how much they would disagree on ethics. So being a Kantian is a controversial thing, or being a Confucian is a controversial thing, etc., etc. So if you want to have something like a global ethics, then you should keep it as minimal as possible. And I think there is an interesting question how such an ethics would look like. I don't have a good answer for it. I'm not here to sell on a particular solution. I'm merely saying that this is an interesting problem to think about. And from what I can see, it's not one that is thought about enough. I guess it's just something to take away and think more.
You got Anna?
Yeah, I have just two issues. First of all, about the issue about how much the interests of the future generations can be reflected in the present market. I'm wondering, there's future generations is a very abstract concept, and as we very well know, there's a big difference between 300 generations away from me and 1 and 2 generations away from me. Now, because the issues of climate change are shaping up in such a way that the impact looks very likely that it's going to be felt by our children and our grandchildren. I wonder if that is something that is already starting to be reflected in our choices and our preferences. So instead of talking in general about the future generations, I'm questioning whether people are starting to make calculations or even having calculations on the assumption that when we're talking about future generations, we're talking about children and grandchildren. Which I think right there you can make a case for that already being reflected in our preferences and our choices. The other thing that I wanted to ask is all connected to I think that we have to find better. If we want to argue that the framework is incorrect, we have to find, I think, much better arguments for things like, you cannot put a model of human life and all these kind of things. But we do put a model of human life. When you have a treatment for cancer that is going to lengthen the life of a criminal patient with 6 months and it's going to cost a fortune, you have to make the decision whether it is going to apply or it's not going to apply. I don't see another framework in which you can, when you have a distribution of goods, it's not entirely clear how a Kantian is going to work, but I think that this has to be somehow gone very carefully before talking about the framework not being the correct one.
Well, I think your second point relates to what we've been discussing. Sure. This is just an invitation again to think harder, and an invitation to philosophers as well to think harder. Now, your first point, look, effectively you're asking a sociological question. I mean, are people making choices? All I can offer is anecdotal evidence. I haven't studied that in detail. I'm not a sociologist. I think it's yes and no. I mean, at some levels, people don't seem to care. I mean, fuel consumption goes up, generally measured to reduce CO2 are not very popular, and whenever the next economic crisis comes along, the first thing that gets scrapped are carbon reduction measures. So that would suggest that people don't put a huge premium on these things. However, when you talk to local decision makers as opposed to national or even global policy, you get sort of a very different picture. So I was in an event with mayors of various cities recently, and so their line of argument was very much, oh God, I mean, let them quarrel about the reality of climate change and in big conferences. I mean, we see it happening and we just want to cope. So what do we have to do to our flood barriers, and what do we have to do to water reserves? Let's simply get on with business and let's not get lost in these global debates. I mean, that's very much on the vibe that came from people who make local decisions. And so that supports your point that, well, because it concerns our grandchildren, people would actually care. So I think it's a mixed bag, and maybe it slowly sinks in, and then things change, but I think they seem to be changing very slowly. So I can't observe any radical changes so far, at least.
Were there any hands earlier that I missed? Sorry.
Can I try again? I've taught science all my life, chemistry and biology, mostly in the Department of Botany, UWO. Now, I consider it my responsibility just to do as much as I can for the enlightened people. You know, one of the biggest causes for climate change is continental drift. And you know where the drift of, and when the continents get in the wrong place on the planet, they reflect the light, so the planet gets cool. That's why we're in a glacial ice period now. Now, Antarctica is not moving, it's just shifting around in its base because of that, 4 miles of ice that's sitting on top of the damn thing. But it's an interesting fact to know, just for you guys who all take for granted that things true. Guess what's happening to Greenland? It's shifting north-east.
That's pretty slow, though.
Oh yes, it'll take 20 million years, but that means in 20 million years you've got an ice age you've never seen the like of. Because Pangea, that existed a long time ago, I know you don't like to hear the science of it, but Pangea was the cause of the fact that the temperature of the planet was almost 15 degrees warmer because both poles were liquid. If you want to know more, I have a sheet on it. I gave it to you before.
Actually, because what you're doing is you're presenting a view that's very radically different from the people who study climate science.
No, that's not true. Total lie. That is not true, sir.
Sorry.
Well,
I've been polite and I didn't call you.
Well, you said things that can't contradict.
If you really want to get your view out, we're not going to do it here. You should give a talk of your own.
I did.
Well, frankly, I'm in agreement. I have grave concerns for the planet. I don't know where you get the idea that we have 100 years. We certainly do not. The ice shelves in Greenland are melting at a catastrophic rate, and methane gas is being released at unprecedented levels. So you can see this actually through the IPCC. I believe they have updated their analyses, and they've looked at the data that's come in from climatologists and so on. So we're in a very dire situation. We do not have 100 years, but act now.
Maybe that's a good time to end. Thank you.
Good time to end.
Okay, thank you.